Hi, I'm Laurence Parker-Brown. Welcome to the Inside Network. Joining us today to explore the reimagination of defensive portfolios is the National Manager Investments at Thinktank, Lauren Ryan. Welcome, Lauren.
Thanks, Laurence. Great to be back.
My pleasure. So you've got a view that private credit shouldn't just be seen as an alternative, but as a core allocation in portfolios. Can you run us through why you think that's the case, particularly now?
Yeah, the shift into private markets is not a new one for a lot of investors and a lot of advisors. We've seen public debt markets can be quite difficult for individual investors to access. And public markets bring volatility, some of which investors are comfortable with, some of which they're not. So for investors who are comfortable with the illiquidity of private markets, there is an opportunity there to reduce some of your volatility in your portfolio, but also get access to a part of the debt market that traditionally they haven't been able to get access to in the past. So I wouldn't say that this is a new trend. There is also quite a high demand for yield at the moment. We've got an aging population, a population who is looking to generate a relatively steady stream of income, and we have a part of the population who is looking to either complement their current income or reduce the amount that they're working and create income from their assets to live the lifestyle that they're used to. It's not to say that private should replace public. I just think that there's a good argument to consider including a little bit of private markets in your allocation, in your defensive part of your allocation, if you're comfortable with the illiquidity.
We've seen as well, Lauren, that traditional investments, such as bonds, they've shown vulnerability in recent times. If we look at 2022 as a case study, how do you think that should influence the way that advisors frame that as an opportunity set, but also the implications for the broader portfolio?
The way that the public debt market responded to 2022 was probably not something many investors and advisors had seen before, and I'd happily say myself included. And I can imagine that would have been challenging for many to explain to their investors why that volatility was occurring. And it might have been a little bit of a shock for some people to realize that a more defensive public bond part of your portfolio still does carry some downside risk there. It's not to say that there isn't a place for public bonds in your portfolio. It was just a bit of a shock for many, I suspect, that they had that volatility there. And the allocation of private markets was happening well and truly before 2022, but it probably was just a good test case to say to some people, look, if you want to reduce your volatility, private markets can play a role there, but there are other risks associated with that. So when it comes down to the client's comfort around illiquidity and what the underlying asset is and what is it they're trying to achieve from their defensive and bond allocation, because there is quite a wide spectrum of private credit and private markets offering out there, just making sure if they're going to include some private markets in their portfolio, in conjunction with their public markets, just making sure that what actually underpins that private investment is something that they're comfortable with from an illiquidity perspective as well as an underlying asset perspective.
The illiquidity is something you're an advocate for as a driver of returns. But for advisors that are working with a client that maybe it's their first time really exploring private markets, they have that trade-off with liquidity, but that drives returns. How should an advisor frame that conversation in your opinion?
Yeah, I think that the illiquidity premium is probably not the key driver to that conversation. If an investor is investing in a semi-liquid or illiquid asset, they absolutely have to have a premium for that. I think the initial part of that conversation with the client and the investor, is really understanding that client's true illiquidity appetite. So it's quite easy to say to someone, well, you can invest in this fund and they can return every month or every quarter, every 6 months. But it's at our best endeavours, or if liquidity is available. If it's not, what happens? And that's a conversation for the investor and the advisor to have, to really make sure that the investor understands that the allocation to the private markets, that they're comfortable that they may not be able to get that back at the time frame that is offered if something does happen. If they are comfortable with that, genuinely comfortable with that, then there are potentially slightly higher risk-adjusted returns available to that investor. So I think the key thing is also for the client and the advisor understand how does liquidity get generated in this fund? Is it a case of once the asset is built and sold? So is the liquidity event purely on a sale? Okay, well, great. Maybe that's projected to be 3 years, but what if market conditions aren't suitable? It could extend out. Is it a case that the underlying fund invests in amortizing loans, which is where principal is also being repaid as well as interest? Okay, that's a slightly different liquidity event than the sale. Is it a case that you're investing in a non-bank lender who securitizes their loan book? So they package up the loans that they write and they sell them off into the debt capital markets, which creates liquidity. Is it a case that the fund holds 5 to 10% of cash or cash-like equivalents? That creates liquidity. So I think for the advisor exploring this part of the market is firstly understand the client's true illiquidity appetite, and then have a look at how does a certain fund create liquidity, and then try and marry the two up when you're looking at comparing apples with apples and looking at the potential premium on offer.
You've captured very neatly the next question, which is, you led into it. There's a lot of opportunity. Advisors have so many different opportunities to explore private markets, private credit, different structures, different types of geography and other subsectors. So how do you think they, as an advisor, should try and navigate the opportunity set? What are some of the key criteria and questions they should be asking managers?
I would suggest that the due diligence that advisors or licensees or dealer groups do when it comes to their private markets manager is not that dissimilar to how they might do the due diligence on an equities manager or a fixed income manager, because a lot of it's at the top level kind of governance structures. When it comes to reviewing your private markets manager, you want to look at the experience of the management team, their time in market, how have assets performed throughout multiple cycles. Obviously, the recent, sort of maybe over the last 20 years, we've only had a couple of those cycles, but there definitely is that track record of performance across quite a number of managers. When it comes to private markets also, you want to have a look at what happens when things go wrong, because things do go wrong. We're not infallible when it comes to being investment managers or asset managers. And how do the managers go about resolving that problem, or reworking that deal, or what does it look like when something does go wrong? I think that's really important because that's where the illiquidity comes into it. When it comes to, say, non-bank lending, which is a huge part of the private markets right now, a lot of the non-bank lenders, they obtain a lot of their capital from large institutional investors, both domestic and global. So from the advisor's perspective, have a chat with the manager around who at a high level, who are the institutions that support you? How long have they been supporting you for? Understand how that journey has occurred, because it doesn't just start with you having 20 years of experience, 15 different banks that work with you, as an example. It starts with one and it evolves over time. In order to get the institutional support in the debt markets, you have to have a good track record. And it is a bit of a slow and steady grind. So for advisors looking at investing in non-bank lending, credit funds or directly with non-bank lenders, talk to them about the evolution of that institutional support, as well as non-bank lenders who issue into the debt capital markets. There's a lot of governance that's required in order to do that. We have to get ratings from global agencies like Standard & Poor's, Fitch or Moody's, and there's just a lot of institutional level governance and performance that goes along with that. So if you're an advisor looking to step into this part of the market and you're looking at a manager who does have debt capital markets experience, has quite a large number of institutions who support, ask those questions, because they're not new to us. We get asked these questions all the time by our institutional partners, and hopefully understanding how that non-bank lender started from where they are to where they are now and who has supported them along that journey and why will give you a little bit more comfort, because you are investing into a pool most of the time in the non-bank lending space. And hopefully you can get some comfort that these institutions have seen under the hood and they've continued to support that particular originator, and that could be enough for you as the advisor and the investor to get comfort. But in terms of due diligence, it probably wouldn't be that different to how you'd look at your equities or your fixed income. But at the end of the day, ask as many questions as they want. And if you're not getting the answers that you like, there are plenty of us to look at.
Wonderful. So, Lauren, we're trying to reimagine defensive portfolios. How do you think private credit will be reconciled with the traditional assets? Is it complementary? Do you see it replacing in certain spaces some of those investments? What does it look like for a portfolio construction view?
Yeah, I wouldn't go so far to say replace. I just think that the private markets, that there are so many borrowers out there who traditionally would have gone to a bank, and for whatever reason, they utilize the non-bank lending space now. Many of them actually use the non-bank lending space as a initial financing solution before they finance back to a bank. So for investors who are comfortable with illiquidity for a small portion of their portfolio, they are able to get access to a pretty high quality pool of mortgages or assets that not that long ago, the banks would often have been the ones writing those deals. So I wouldn't say it's a replacement by any means, because you really can't put a price on liquidity, especially as people are getting a little bit older, that they want to know they can get their money out, or if markets turn and you want to be able to get money out and take advantage of a different solution, having that liquidity is quite important. But there is an argument for, one, smoothing over volatility of a portfolio, but also getting access to some pretty attractive risk-adjusted returns that are underpinned by borrowers who, in many cases in non-bank lending space, either were previously achieving finance from the banks or who are not far off refinancing to the banks. Again, there is a very wide spectrum of non-bank lending and private credit, so please make sure you understand the investment and what it is that you're looking at. But I would say that private markets can definitely complement public markets when you're looking at a defensive portfolio construction.
Well, that's very nicely explained. I hope advisors will reach out if they have further questions.
Thanks so much, Laurence.